thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for a fascinating panel discussion from our illustrious guests that are joining us. I'd like to say a big thank you first to Roxanne Zand, who has for a number of talks this year been inviting people and bringing people together for us. And she always comes up with really dynamic, engaging topics. So an enormous thank you, Roxanne. I'm going to start with our first panelist, and I'll give you a little bit of introduction, although she doesn't need much. She's very well known to most of us. And then we'll be moving on to our other two panelists. So to begin with, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Amy Cappellazzo. Amy's, of course, the former chairman of the Fine Art Division of Sotheby's. And prior to that, she founded Art Agency Partners with Alan Schwartzman. And then, of course, Sotheby's acquired that for a very large amount, which I think is reported widely in the news. And then before that, at Christie's, where she was chairman of post-war and contemporary development for 13 years and directed many groundbreaking initiatives that led to record results with upward of $650 million US realized in a single sale. And of course, previously an art advisor, curator, key figure in the establishment of Art Basel in Miami Beach. And I could go on and on and on, but suffice it to say, she's really considered by many as a sort of rainmaker in the art market. And she left Sotheby's in July and will be starting a new company in the autumn. So we shall discover more about that after the summer, once she's had a chance to recharge and relax. So Amy, thank you for joining us today. It is such a pleasure to have you with us. And I wonder if I could begin by inviting you to share with us your insights and any anecdotes on how the art world has changed for you in the last 10 years. You've been such a key player in it. I wonder if you're able to take a moment to sort of step back and have that sense of perspective on some of the changes you've witnessed.
Well, thank you, first of all, for including me as part of this panel. I'm thrilled to be here. I am currently in my recharge, so I feel like this is the first time in like a whole week where I'm thinking very deeply about issues in the art market. So certainly the last 10 years have been marked by constant and ongoing disruption in the art market, both capital disruption and technological disruption, and even we might say geographic disruption, which sometimes involves legislation or regulation, sometimes just involves the shifting of power and geography. And so for the last 10 years, that's been pretty constant. And I think the technology part is probably the part that is going to be the most impactful for the next couple of years. For the last 10, I would say, yes, during the year of COVID, there was tremendous technological disruption. In the previous years before COVID, say the previous 8 or 9, it was largely a capital disruption that was happening. There was so much capital coming into the art market. It was repricing everything. It was changing the flow of distribution of where things were going. It was inviting so much more capital in the market that it was making the art market arguably a more trustworthy place for people to think about participating, think about putting their own capital, being a player. And that's just going to keep going. There's just going to be more and more and more of that.
Good to hear that optimistic outlook. And how does that translate into, your personal collecting? I mean, obviously you collect from passion. Do you also collect with a kind of market view in mind? And what do you collect personally? What attracts you to those artists' works?
Well, I do collect. I always collect. I probably, if I sat down with a very conventional financial advisor, they would say I had too much money in art and I spend too much money on that side of things. But I do, I have 2 children, so I feel like I am managing some legacy in the collection in some way. And I try to think of things that my children will understand and relate to from their perspective. They're both college age, so they're vaguely adults at the moment. So I know their tastes and sensibilities very well. I am, I do feel like my skill, or by necessity, economically, I'm collecting what I think is not quite yet happening, but what I think will get a critical evaluation or reevaluation moving forward. So that includes many young contemporary artists that I bought for, who are from maybe their first exhibitions, the first shows. right on through to, I recently, bought a couple of Georgia O'Keeffe's, and that would be the opposite side of the collection. But like all collections that are born out of passion, it is deeply personal and idiosyncratic in places. It is not a textbook it's not an investment portfolio where absolutely everything must matter and have a mark-to-market return annualized. Like, it doesn't work that way at all. So, but I do feel like I'm a little bit in charge of spending my children's money in some way this way. So I have to be sort of intelligent about what I'm doing.
I think that's actually a fascinating sort of topic, that idea of legacy, of what you're leaving on, and how to kind of shape it with that in mind. I'd love to come back to that later on. But for now, we're going to invite our second panelist, Kate Bryan, to sort of share her views. Kate is, of course, an arts broadcaster, curator, mentor, writer, head of collections for Soho House, so can give us that kind of perspective of kind of building up an institutional collection in that sense. And she acquires works for Soho House globally, and she's custodian to a collection of nearly 6,000 works. She's also written and presented television programs for Sky Art, Sky Arte Italia, BBC Two, BBC Four. She's the presenter of Inside Art, and she's also a judge on the annual Sky Arts competition, and the author of The Art of Love, which looks at sort of artist couples. So, a huge portfolio across art. And Kate, you've been a prominent figure in the art world now, not least as a commentator and collection builder, but also as someone who's passionate about bringing art to a wider audience and making it accessible to as wide an audience as possible. Can you share some initial insights on how the art world's changed for you in the last 10 years, and more about your personal journey into the art world? What drew you to it?
What drew me to the art world? I didn't know the art world existed till I was about 17, so I was a bit of a late starter, but I made art every single day as a child. I just loved art. But I didn't grow up in a family that went to museums and galleries or that had art on the wall, although my parents loved the Impressionists. Actually, we had reproduction print things, but I just loved making art, but I realized I wasn't very good at it when I hit about 17. I had no original ideas, and I just love talking about art, and I will talk to anyone that will listen, which is what I always say. So I discovered art history just purely by chance, and went to university and studied that, and then got into the art world. My first job was at the British Museum. I applied to like 74 jobs before I got my first job, and then was making tea for the director of the British Museum, Neil Mcgregor, who's an extraordinary man and really was very generous with his time, and he's a great speaker, and he set me on a public speaking course when I was like 23. And I used to attend all his lectures with him, with his slides in the little carousel, put them in upside down, and he would try to pretend he wasn't cross at me. And so really just sort of got in. And then I think once I realized I was in the art world, I thought, wow, this is quite an extraordinary place. It's so exceptional. Everybody's fantastic, but there weren't many people from working class backgrounds, everyone seemed to have a sort of shared landscape that I wasn't part of. Not to say that I ever felt excluded, but certainly I was just conscious of the fact that it was a bit of a fluke that I'd got in somehow. And so I think I've always just had that thing of wanting to leave the door open behind me. Like, they were mad enough to let me in, so I'm going to let in other people too. And I have to say that I think one of the most exciting changes for me since I've been in the art world, certainly over the last 10 years, is that I just think that the landscape is shifting, that it's a lot easier to speak to, hear from, have dialogue with, include, learn from, educate with people from underrepresented backgrounds, whatever background that might be. I think that technology has played a huge role in that. And I think that we are all very conscious of the fact that we need to have a multiplicity of voices and a diversity of voices, and that anybody that's not really putting that at front and center of their business or their collecting habits or even the books that they buy is probably feels guilty on some level if they're not able to do that, because there really isn't any excuse at the moment. And I think that that's been really exciting for me, and also to just see the changing landscape for women artists particularly. That it feels like there have been huge steps forward. I hope that we don't end up taking 2 steps backward again, but they definitely feel like we've made huge breakthroughs, and that it doesn't feel like the conversation starts and then disappears again for 2 years and then starts again. It feels like it's a constant conversation. There's still an enormous amount of work to be done about representation, but I feel like the conversation is now at least a constant conversation, and that even if people are involved in that conversation, say, for example, on a corporate level, you know, like a law firm or a bank, not to point fingers, even if they're doing it because they know they have to do it, they're still doing it. And that everybody now, I think, is being more responsible in their attitudes. So I think that's probably the biggest shift for me. And as someone who works globally and works predominantly really for my own personal collecting and for a large part of what I do in Soho House, I'm always looking for young talent. And that has become easier and easier and easier to find. And that's so exciting for me. My job got easier and more thrilling and more exciting because I just feel so connected to people. So that's a big change.
So quite a few things to sort of pull out there. One, in terms of female representation, you know, whether in museums or in the art market, getting that parity. And another is, you know, of course, the Soho House collection and how you've been building that. We might come back to those things later. But just on a personal note, could you share a little bit about what you might collect yourself?
Yeah, I was really interested in how Amy phrased it, because it's a sort of, how do you politely and intelligently say you buy what you love without sounding like, and I think Amy nailed it, because idiosyncratic is the right word. I mean, I have a daughter as well, and I do think every time I spend any sort of significant sum of money that I have to be doing it sort of respectfully, that is this going somewhere good in the world? Does it bring something into our lives that we really love? I love a big painting. I don't have a big enough house for lots of big paintings, but I have ambitions for lots more big paintings. I'm really interested in work that's very, that has an agenda. So I'm very happy to have quite conceptual work, quite political work at home. I kind of enjoy living with stuff like that. But conversely, you know, sometimes I just fall in love with the painting because it reminds me of when I lived in Rome, and I just can't help myself. But I'm lucky because I'm seeing new stuff all the time, and you know, I'm seeing that fantastic price point, you know, that the gorgeous moment where you're actually doing an artist a favor by buying a work of theirs, and you're getting, you know, a great work of art for like $1,000 or $2,000, and it's just it just feels like it's great for everybody. And so that's really what I'm doing. I'm tending to support younger artists, and I'm lucky I get gifts for writing for people and things like that.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I'm now going to introduce our third panelist, who is the amazing Lady Alison Dayton, who attained her MBA in finance from the University of Chicago and worked in New York and London in investment banking and foreign exchange at Goldman Sachs before moving to Rothschild as director in the firm's fixed income asset management division. And for the past 25 years, Alison's been an active private investor in early stage technology and biotech firms, as well as in residential and commercial real estate in the US, UK, and Europe. She currently sits on the advisory boards of startup technology companies such as Go Games Limited, and is the president and CEO of Oasis Sarparea, which is a real estate company engaged in resort development in Puglia, Italy. Aside from all these incredible achievements, she's committed to supporting creative talent in both the visual and performing arts. And in 2017, she and her husband, Paul Deighton, established a family foundation to promote art through cultural exchange, artistic development, and arts education. And so DFF established the Venucci Artist Residency in 2017, we'll come back to that, and located in Umbria. The residency aims to provide international emerging artists with the opportunity to live and work in Italy and collaborate with local artisans. Can I move there? I'd love to. That sounds amazing.
Always welcome.
Alison is currently a trustee of the Royal Academy of Arts and a governor of the Royal Ballet. So Alice, you've also been an incredibly prominent figure in the art world over the last decade, not least as a philanthropist and a collector. So can you share your insights and any anecdotes on how the art world's changed over the last 10 years? And also, can you share something with us about your art collection, because you do have a phenomenal one, and we'd love to know how that was shaped and which artists you've included in it.
Try to stop me. Yeah, exactly. Having been on a panel with two actually like-minded art professionals, I think they've covered so many aspects already. So I'll speak really from the personal perspective of a collector, and one that certainly isn't an art professional and has absolutely no talent. But I did grow up in a family that was very appreciative of both the visual and the performing arts. I actually was a musician. I was a clarinetist, saxophonist. And so I always had an affinity to the arts. With my first bonus check when I was 24 years of age, I bought a glass art piece by William Morris, who is still in the collection today, and who is one of the renowned, actually, glass artists, American glass artists at his time. So you can tell I really rarely sell anything. I sort of accumulate. I randomly collected until about 15 years ago. I reached a point where I just decided I needed to be more disciplined, that I was getting really serious about this. I was incredibly engaged, but I knew what I didn't know. And I also realized that my tastes were changing periodically, and that was perhaps the result of education, seeing more, seeing a lot. And as I saw more, as I gained more information and insights, my taste developed, and I got more courageous, but also wiser. So I decided at that time to educate myself, create a program, and very importantly, at least for me, to find like-minded people to work with. My art advisor is Tamara Nunn and Ellie Zaguri, which isn't important to everybody, but has been very important to me, who shared both my interest in sociopolitical issues, because I'm very much oriented that way also through my husband and my family. We are a politically tuned family. Shared that interest, and also shared an interest in the philanthropic power of art. So we work together through really across all of my interests, the collection and the philanthropy. When I first started 15 years ago, like Amy, and I see now like Kate, because I'm a tech investor and used to working with provocative minds and courageous souls, I went naturally towards the contemporary art. And I felt brave enough to try to find that new talent, which is again why I needed more assistance. So having seen a lot and so forth, I embarked in first Asia, because 15 years ago, Asia was really, with the economic reforms that were going on, but the political stagnation, there were a lot of reactions from the artists. My curators were very steeped in Asia and had gotten there perhaps even 10 years before that. And so I started with artists like Zhang Fi, Shagong, who were commenting on what was happening politically there. And then then I had the fortune to really run across the works of Kerry James Marshall and have actually discussions with Kerry, who completely just blew me away in terms of his insights of the power of art to really revise, or let's put this, annotate history with the reality of a population lost or a people lost in history. And his objective, of course, was to bring the images of Black people into our cultural institutions, so that when young children, when Black people go into the institutions, they understand their place in history through visual image, which was very important to him. And then, of course, he became, and this became a major strain of my work as I collected Kerry and all of the wonderful artists that he mentored, like Toyin Ojiadutula, Lynette Yadon-Boake, and many, many others. I also started looking at female artists, like Eliza Nisenbaum and Caroline Walker, new artists like Derek Forger.
I'm just going to invite Maravi to put your lovely, you did send us some images of some of your artworks that you've mentioned with Lynette and Kerry James Marshall.
What has happened to that space, and I think it's been a really positive development, is that people have sort of caught up with me. And the market has been, I think, developed a craze for these fabulous artists, as they should do. But as is my disposition, I sort of pivot at that point also, because I feel it's really important. I went into contemporary art to learn from these contemporary artists, but also to have a relationship with them and to assist them and to be in dialogue. And I feel like when there's too much movement in an art market, which I think there is a little bit in African American and diaspora, I sort of start looking, what are people missing? What else do I need to support? What other artists are out there that I can support? So about 10 years ago, also female art. And I found the work, as one says, you sort of go back to some anchors in some respect, the work of Dorothea Tanning, who I think influenced many women after her, even, I think she was even before Louise Bourgeois. But you can see, if one had the opportunity to go see her show at the Tate, the influence she probably had artists like Sarah Lucas, you know, through her Pompidou exhibition. Jenny Savile to me is an also artist I absolutely adore for the same reason that not only is she have a new look on feminist art, on obsession with our bodies and the strength and attitude that she has with her work, but she's influenced a myriad of other wonderful female artists like Emily May Smith, who you see here on the screen, very young artists like Jordan Casey, also Lisa Bryce, etc. But like the other two on the panelists here, I don't like to be restricted. I think my tendencies are to just look at quality, excellent technique, people who are speaking in a unique language. They do map into my collection because we all have our soft points. So I would say my third vein, besides sociopolitical art and feminist artists or supporting female artists, not always feminists, would be process-oriented art, which I think actually is developing. Once again, there's this whole revival. We've gone into the deeply figurative for a while, which is a lovely thing to have been part of. And I think, which I always loved and why I started there in some respects. But going back now to exploring, again, new abstraction, almost re-looking at some of the Abex and other, you know, Dada and so forth, periods of the past. So, and new materials, people like Sheila Hicks, Kathleen Ryan, Kohen Nawa, Alvaro Barentine, for instance. So it's, I think, a cohesive collection, but with several veins. And what is most important to me is that it's very personal. And it's not only personal to me, but it really has, my children are a little bit bigger than the others. They're 31 and 33. And they're very much now involved because it speaks to them as well. So.
Thank you for sharing those insights. Haif Zamzam, who is a great supporter of arts in the UAE in Abu Dhabi, has already asked a question, and I encourage others, if they wish you, to ask questions as you go along, which is just listening to you, that it feels important that as a collection grows, you focus on themes or frameworks or structures, and that it's more satisfying that way. I think, would you agree with that, or is it always?
You know, that's me. I believe in the old saying that every collector has their own journey, and whatever satisfies you works for you. I don't know that there is a right or a wrong of it. For me, I'm a structured thinker. I'm a strong thinker about what interests me. So I tend to pursue those various avenues quite precisely. It adds structure also to my buying. I mean, you know, listen, a collector, it's a bug you can't shake. So you really end up spending, you'd fall in love with so many different artists. And let's face it, what's wonderful, what has happened in the last 15 years of my collecting is that art has become an acceptable career. There are more and more artists entering the market because there's more and more people accessing the market. And so you could go crazy geographically, you know, across the ages, selecting what you buy. To be honest, I didn't buy dead artists until recently. And this is like a new phase for me to start really connecting what I'm doing today with what came before. So you'll evolve, and you've got to choose your own path, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn to another question for all our panelists, really, which is kind of a look at, you know, where we are today. We've looked a little bit at what's been happening in the last 10 years and how you've individually built up collections and how you've thought about the market retrospectively. But of course, you know, with the pandemic, for example, we've seen an enormous digital expansion for the art world. And Amy, I know that as part of your stewardship of Sotheby's, you looked after digital expansion, and you're very familiar with the world of NFTs and alternative currencies. And can you share your views on how you think this is transforming the art markets today?
Sure. Well, I will certainly say I looked after digital expansion with a host of other people who were immensely, you know, helpful and involved as well, because my knowledge of the digital world really comes from instinct rather than from having a computer science background myself or understanding the actual guts of it, the technology of it. But I can see that Well, all the digital transformation is about opening up the marketplace so that more and more people enter it. And that's the point of it. It becomes less of a sort of, to quote a former colleague of mine at Sotheby, a sort of golf club of participants into something that's a larger, fuller, more robust marketplace. I think that the digital expansion under COVID was enormous, and it's been well chronicled and documented across a number of fields, but we all depended on moving auctions online, being able to transact online. The comfort factor for even the old guard collector of buying things they hadn't seen started to happen. I mean, there was always been collectors in Asia who didn't always get to New York or London for the auctions, who had to be comfortable to buy online if they were, from what they saw online, if they were really going to want something. Similarly, maybe at lower price points, people felt a little bit more comfortable, but we really did start to see a more robust transacting at higher price points during COVID. And I don't suspect, well, people highly welcome the opportunity to see art in person again and to travel around a bit more and really be able to have that human experience with an object or a work of art in person. I think you will see that trend continue where people will buy things online. As it pertains to NFTs, so NFTs are of enormous interest to me for a variety of reasons. They are a little bit, just to say, whatever NFTs look like today isn't what they're going to look like down the road. So if you can imagine, we're having this panel and it's 1990 and we're all talking about this great idea called the World Wide Web. And we're like, wow, the World Wide Web. You mean you'll be able to ask it a question and it will give you an answer with reasonable accuracy? Like, no way, that's crazy. So, in terms of what it became, what it was then, and then what it became and where we are today with that kind of digital transformation, it goes without saying. In the world of NFTs, what interests me the most is the artist's voice and participation in them, and how artists will be able to track the location of their piece via the blockchain ledger of where things are moving and when things trade within the blockchain itself. Move from, say, owner to owner, and also how artists could gain or glean royalties when trades are made. So that's something that becomes very interesting to artists, and why I think every artist needs to be interested in NFTs as a way of understanding how their future or the future of their marketplace might look. So you could quickly imagine where an NFT could replace or sort of supplant the print and multiple marketplace, because artists would be able to keep track of it, because the technologies are potentially to do interesting things if they want that form of art making through a digital medium, or just that they can track and retain royalties as trades are made. That's probably one of the most interesting things about NFTs, and how it's just in its nascent stages and infancies, and for lots of artists at very advanced stations of their career, they're probably okay to not pay attention to it too much. But for anybody who's expecting to have 20, 25, 30 more years, 50 more years of art making ahead of them, it's going to be immensely important.
So really that idea of kind of artist royalties being embedded in the code for them when they sell works, sort of through NFTs, that kind of protecting the artist is something transformational.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's protecting the artist as much as it's empowering them. I think artists don't really need protecting. I think they need agency, like personal, to understand the world as it is and take it in their hands.
Alice,
I don't really think of artists as like fragile souls that need need guarding and protecting. So yeah.
I'm going to ask you, Alison, from a kind of collective perspective, do you think artists need guiding or enabling, empowering? I like that kind of.
I totally agree with Amy on this. I think well, as a collector, I would never say that I'm guiding them as so much as just facilitating and supporting, almost sometimes being the producer, if I may say, supporting some work they want to do. I do think that digital will allow artists more agency, and I think that is a great thing. I also, as a tech investor, am kind of interested in what's going to happen in that space. I'm much, if I can pivot a little bit the question, as a collector, I'm much more dissatisfied with the digital, the typical negative impacts of broadening a market indiscriminately and broadly, which is you get a lot of speculation. And this aspect concerns me, because I think this aspect actually is causing a lot of stress for artists who are not being able to capture their market and to guide their own market entry, because it gets carried away by this enlarged and passionate, which are all good things, but uncontrollable. So you've got a lot more, I guess, burden on the gallery, on the institutions to try to keep an eye on what's happening there so that young careers can grow steadily where there's space and time for discovery. Because I think when you look at many, at least in my collection, I buy artists 3 months before they go 25 times value. You know, at a 24 to 26-year-old artist, this is mind-blowing. And I disagree that that's positive, because it causes a huge amount of stress for them when the market therefore tries to keep up, because like any market, when it starts going up, everybody piles in who's not too smart, right? Who's not looking ahead. So there is an opposite side, but I do think it's exciting. And I just think, like any new phase in a market, there's going to be negative disruption as well as positive disruption.
I often say that the market is like the weather, and there's no way to really, there's no value judgment on the weather. It just kind of is what it is. And you're better off to learn how to manage it by carrying an umbrella or, you know, preparing yourself for it, rather than, I don't think there's any force around it. I mean, a market could become laden with criminal activity, and that would be a value judgment, of course. But as long as a market, if you're selling things and the market takes off and becomes bigger and more robust, all you can do is become smarter about how you sell things, or smarter about your production and distribution of those things. So I feel like for artists who hate the market, it's more a question of fortifying them with an umbrella and a good rain slicker, or what do you call it, like a Macintosh, whatever, so they can, you know, feel fortified and feel able to manage it. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess you could lament its growth, like something's lost and something's gained and live in every day, to quote the great Joni Mitchell. And we're kind of just, you know, in that moment. And to be an artist now and to have any measure of success is to have to understand and deal with this, and to deal with the fear factor of falling, or the fear factor of your market getting out of hand. Look, I don't think artists are ever in control of their markets. I think to try to control the market is usually a bad thing every which way, right? It's usually a fixed market then, and that's not really, you're not going to, the benefits will not inure properly to an artist if it's a fixed or closed market. So dealing with the bigger market and all the good and bad within it is just,
but I do think that it's a new avenue. In a way, it's kind of an interesting avenue for the collector, because the burden is kind of on us as well. Actually, it's not a burden. We need to get smarter. We need to be sensitive to what's happening, and we need to consider it. I mean, it just is a new consideration. It's actually makes the market, it can be frustrating for me, because it also, all of a sudden, whereas I always had access because I was first in, now you're grappling with thousands, you know, and of course,
right. It's more competitive marketplace, right?
Competitive, exactly. But at the same time, when I can do something for the artist, boy, they're grateful. And if I can sort of facilitate, you know, be patient and so on, that you get other benefits out of it. So I do believe in an open market.
A few comments from people attending the talk. Alain Savile says, love these wise comments, Lady Alison. It's true, collectors must be worried by the way money is harming art and creation. And Charles El-Sidawi asks, you know, you talked a little bit about speculation and moments in the art market. In recent years, there's been quite a focus on contemporary African art. It's good for the market in some ways because it helps it grow. In other ways, it's speculation, and some prices get driven up without being sustainable. What would your view be in that way?
It's interesting because I actually had a young gentleman, 35 or something, yesterday asked to speak with me. He's from Nigeria. He's a designer here who I know through some projects, who has decided to collect African art, Nigerian art to start with, because he knows all these artists through his family and through the community. And he was showing me, he said, I have this list, you know, I have this list, look at my list. And so we went through sort of 20 artists, young artists that he was looking at in Benin, Nigeria, mostly, some Ghanaian. And it was, he has a new eye. And so I just sort of very softly said, just look at these artists who do they look like? And I pulled up some images of some of those, like Bouaka, who have grown and, become really famous. Abudia, I said, they're remarkably similar, And he said, yes, we have a tendency to look at success and mimic it. And I said, well, there you go. So that's your challenge, is to find the new voice amongst that, because they can't all be winners like the guys who came before them and who made the initial input. So I actually think the latecomers into African-American art, which for me for 15 years has been absolutely fascinating, and there's so much talent there. But now there's such big names and there's so much of a craze about it that there's a lot of mimicry, and there's a lot of perhaps not so interesting artwork that's getting too much attention. So it's more a warning again to us collectors to keep looking and looking carefully and not just enter the craze.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Kate, actually, just thinking about artists that are getting more representation. There's also now more of a focus on female artists, whether with major museum shows that are coming up. And that's, I know, a big passion project of yours. Can you tell us maybe more about your Vault 100 collection, what you were trying to say there, and some of your thoughts around sort of achieving parity for female artists in the art market and also in collections?
Yeah, sure. So when I joined Soho House, it was 2016, and I inherited the collection, which was already quite large, at about 2,000 artworks. And I was pleased to see that it had a decent representation of women artists. I think it was we didn't have a very robust cataloguing system then. The collection started quite organically. But I was looking at it and I thought, okay, we're about 40%, that's pretty good. And then I realized that we were going to open this site called the Ned, which was a sister company to Soho House. So Soho House is a creative members space. So everybody who's a member there is from the creative community. It's now 26 years old and is in 9 countries and counting. And we were opening this site in the city of London called the Ned, which was different membership base, and it was very much geared towards those who worked in the city. So we were, in my head, I had this prejudice that it would be full of, middle-aged guys in double-breasted suits smoking cigars, and that was my prejudice. And as it transpires, that wasn't the membership basis at all. It was a really interesting, dynamic group of people, a lot of whom had a fantastic cultural pastimes, as well as being philanthropists and being really interesting people. And they obviously also worked in the city or nearby. But a lot of people who actually lived in Shoreditch became a member. Anyway, as a consequence of this fear, what I tend to do curatorially is always identify the thing that worries me, concerns me, is weird, is strange, is a problem to be solved, and usually put it at the heart of the premise so that you kind of just don't try and hide anything. So what I did was take the FTSE 100 CEO gender ratio, which at that time was 93 men running FTSE 100 companies and just 7 women. And I inverted it. So I collected 100 works and there were 93 women and 7 men. And this was 2016. And in all seriousness, a few people said to me, will you find 93 great women artists who are working in the UK? As if there were 5. And that really alarmed me, that was being asked by me. The other thing that alarmed me is that people would say, oh, who are going to be your 7 men? And they got very fixated on the 7 men. Are you going to have Damien Hirst as one of your 7 men? And I realized I had another problem there. So the 7 men actually got into the collection by virtue of being a collaborator with a woman artist. So for example, Langlands and Bell. And we opened that collection, and I kind of was very excited about doing something that was going to get terribly out of date and make me look like really backward looking, because the FTSE 100 ratio was going to change so much, and actually it's got worse. And so we opened that collection then, but it was really interesting because around that came up a lot of questions about the way in which you curate the responsibility you have, because I had to keep asking myself, am I basically making a women art ghetto here? Are there going to be a lot of women artists that don't want to be part of this collection because it is so women centric and they would like their practice to be seen in a more mainstream environment? Are there women artists who feel that that you somehow sideline their practice by doing this? Or those kind of questions came to me, and I realized there aren't any very easy answers for them, and that you have to just keep working really hard. And even in the short space of a few years, I would do it so differently now. I would be much more mindful of the way I threw around gender as a fixed concept. I would be much more mindful of representation. There were no non-binary people in that collection, for example, at that stage. And so it's so fascinating to me that just in such a short space of time, 5-6 years, that you can look at this project that you did with the best of intentions, and you had a lot of people around you and everyone was really supporting it. And it's not to say I don't stand by it, of course I do, and it did a lot of interesting things, and a lot of those artists sold to the members, and a lot of those artists went on to becoming group shows with one another or share a studio space. It became like a really nice community, a lot of cross-fertilization. But it was so fascinating because it in no way fixed anything. It just created a lot more intellectual problems, which I have really felt have propelled me forward in my career and have really helped me become a more sensitive curator, and someone who basically realizes that, which I think is a lot of what Alison is talking about, is that as someone who is responsible for collecting, whether you're spending your own money or a company's money, or you're doing everything through exchange, which is what we tend to do, which is the kind of column door system where we give artists membership and credit. So we are the great feeder of artists. We give them food and drink and hotel rooms. And that's been fundamental to the success of the collection, really, that we don't operate in a commercial way. We are very much sort of a strange, quite beautiful little beast that's not a museum, because we have Oscar Murillo next to the dance floor. We're not a domestic home because nothing matches, nothing looks good together, usually in a traditional calming sense. It's usually like my job to try and disrupt the feeling of the room as much as I can, so the artwork really gets its attention paid to it. And but also at the same time, it's not a corporate collection, it's not in a bank, it's not in a vault. It's very much there to be enjoyed and used by the members. So I think that, what's so interesting is that in navigating that space of being non-commercial, I'm always just thinking, how can I be better? And it just comes down time and time again. It's just education and research and talking to artists, talking to museum critics, reading loads. I mean, it's just a huge part of what I do is basically studying. And I think that's why I've got my dream job, because I'm a real geek and I love having a lot of books around me. But obviously working in the contemporary art world, usually the book comes 6 years after you finish the project and it's already out of date. So, tying things back to history is really valuable as well. But I think to someone's point earlier on about trends and shaping collections, with Soho House, I have a great chance every time I open a new site to begin again with a curatorial premise. And that's really interesting to me. And working with consultants, so we're opening Brighton in a few months. And of course, in Brighton, it's such a haven for the queer community, and historically has links to amazing cities like San Francisco as a consequence of that. And so we knew we wanted a collection that really spoke to that. So we brought in a curator to be a consultant for us, who's Gemma Bentley, who's a queer art specialist. She herself is gay, and she's got fantastic relationships globally, but particularly within London and Brighton. And she's putting that collection together for us. And so it can become this sort of snapshot. It can become like a little historic moment of looking at art made in that area, in this precise moment, and will hopefully become useful springboard. But we were just talking yesterday that even understanding that her doing this and doing it with the greatest will in the world for the best representation possible, being really robust, and really we're interrogating it from every single angle, you still realize that in 5 years' time you'll want to redo the whole thing again. And I think that's the great thing about this industry that we all work in, this market that we are in. But it's also the terrifying thing, which is that there's, what you did 5 years ago is not really contemporary anymore. I think contemporary has got shorter and shorter in terms of the phenomenon of really feeling that you are on top of the zeitgeist. And that's thrilling to me and really exciting, but is also, is hard to really confront that as a concept.
I'm going to ask Amy, just because you became, so sort of high up, as it were, in the echelons of the art world. Did you ever feel there was a glass ceiling for you because of being female, or not? I mean, was it a men's world? Was it when you first joined? Did you have to kind of, politic and sort of hustle in a very male-dominated world, or was it always quite easy to kind of navigate up?
I'd just like to say one thing about Kate's comment, and then I'll move to that very poignant question. I would like to say that most of my career has been spent on managing the glare. Like, how can you survive the glare of early success in your career and have staying power? And that's usually been my career advice to art. Like, most artists call me not when they want to sell something up from their show at a gallery, or sometimes they do for like advisory clients, but it's more about, okay, oh my God, like I'm like rising so fast, and like I had one show and it didn't sell as well. What's next? How do I move to how do I survive the glare of, how do I not act like a moth to the flame? And then how do I reboot myself so I'm not in the dustbin of art history 5 years from now, kind of thing. So I think, Kate, what you're talking, as someone who's often working on the other end, it would be really great to have a long lunch with you where we could talk a little bit about how artists, how you help them with their, how to sustain themselves and how to sort of run the marathon a little bit longer, let's say. But okay, so my career as a woman, well, first of all, I've only ever lived in this body, so I really can't compare what it would be like to be in another station or time. I will say that, you know, well, typically everybody on the panel would say there's been moments of challenges where we were standing in a boys' club and it felt a little bit like we had to sort of elbow our way in for a voice. There's never been a better time to be a woman professional than today. And today it's better than it was 5 years ago, and then 5 years before that, and 5 years before. So I feel like, you know, the march forward, or at least lucky for us, those of us who are able to work in this industry and the cities we work in and the places we work in, and, you know, what we do, it's not that way universally for all women, as we know, but we certainly can count ourselves among the lucky ones. And I'm confident that the march forward really has serious traction, and it won't move backward for my daughter or anyone else's daughter on this panel, that they'll see continued progress. I mean, certainly there's been moments that are, you know, complete, like I was as someone who came to the art world and to the auction world, not from that world, but rather from a curatorial background and a life of working with artists. I couldn't believe how conservative the art world was at the upper echelons. I thought it was sort of shocking. Like, didn't we choose this world because it was, you know, expansive and intellectual and interesting and cool? And so I was a bit surprised to learn all of that. But sharing power will always be, you know, a kind of tug of war when it comes time to actually share it. So you have to be smart and integrous to yourself, and probably a little bit tough. And I don't know, I think it's I think there's definitely been moments where it felt that way, but I don't also particularly care what men think of me or I'm not trying to please them, I have 3 older brothers. I grew up in a locker room of a house. You know, I'm used to sort of having to sort of shout a little bit louder, elbow a little bit more to get my way, and to be unafraid of saying that, or unafraid of the consequences of what I say or do. So so I'm okay. It just means you have to be a little bit more aware and a little bit more like a heat-seeking missile about getting your point across.
That's good advice. And Alison, I'm going to ask you now, sort of shifting our conversation to a kind of wider arena. You do a lot of philanthropic work with Women for Women, and that's obviously looking in a very different context at sort of female empowerment. Can you tell us more about that initiative and some of the sort of art-related fundraising work you've done around that?
Sure. So yes, indeed, having been in investment banking and being the oldest one on the panels, I am very concerned about women's issues, but increasingly concerned about women who are so far away from us and who are incredibly marginalized, who don't impact our lives and who are forgotten. So I found Women for Women through Savile, who is an inspirational person, probably some 12, 15 years ago, and became involved with the organization. And it's one of the first NGOs to work with these most marginalized women in war-torn countries who have really lost everything due to conflict, and who in the majority have also been physically abused as a result. And there's one of the generals in the UN stated a couple of years ago, and I think it's actually become worse, not better, is that women have become the most important armament of war. Destroying women destroys the family, destroys the community, results in the lack of peace and unity to bring about peace. So it's been, it's a small organization actually, but it's been one that's really captured my interest. And through my association, we had some very successful, actually, art auctions, but I was asked when ISIS was very strong, as well as Boko Haram, in 2015, somewhere around there, to raise funds so that we could dramatically increase the number of programs we were running in Syria and Nigeria. And in fact, I had started the Nigerian program, so felt very strongly about trying to participate in that. I took a step back because I really hate running galas. I really avoid chairing any of these as much as possible. But this one, I kind of couldn't say no, particularly because they were threatened to have another auction. And I thought our artists were just fatigued and we were going to get schlock, and therefore we wouldn't raise enough. So I do what I normally do, is turn two of my art advisors who are always on board and who are extremely philanthropic, and said, okay, on board, let's do performance and installation art. And let's emote. Let's really get people from the minute they walk in the door to feel it. And there was nothing better in my mind to do that than performance art. So we went about, and it was very scary for this organization because that meant we were really producing an art event. And I had to raise money to produce the event and make sure that that was all covered, because of course, every pound we earned had to go towards the program. We encountered, however, incredible generosity. I think also because the idea was so outlandish and so weird and so wonderful that people came on board. We had Pace and David Gill, Victoria Moreau. We had artists that we were very close to. And I think it did come from, we had excellent relationships with artists, all the artists that came on board, more or less. I was very close with Kohe Nawa, who had never, for some reason, despite being one of the leading multidisciplinary artists in Asia, had never had a UK exhibition. We introduced him to Pace. Pace loved his work. They agreed to run a simultaneous exhibition, and we would premiere his first installation, which is what he's known for at our event. And in fact, it became sort of the walkway that all of our attendees took. He had some major, monumental sculptures of strong women that were the focus of this installation. We also flew in some very exciting performance artists, like, and I'm going to absolutely obliterate this name, and did one, I called her Nelly because I couldn't pronounce it, but it's Nusseibeh and Mocha J. van Duren from South Africa. She actually works a lot with genital mutilation, but also understands what's happening in terms of abuse of women as an element of war. So we flew her over. We had a photography studio with Leonce Abugelo. It was a very exciting evening. When our guests arrived, they had to walk through a performance art by Amanda Coogan, so that basically with mirrors, looking at women, and it was from the very beginning an engagement. Right, and we had Nelly giving her performance right before a live auction, where we developed a new concept, which was, okay, artists, you are being put on the line, you're contributing this art, but it can ruin your auction history if it's not bid on. It's a smaller audience. So let's just guarantee that you're gonna do well. So we underwrote each one of these pieces of art that they contributed, and therefore we got amazing pieces of art. I mean, Etel Adnan had a beautiful piece in there. Zaha Hadid had two of her stools. Fabien Verdier, a beautiful work. Kevin Francis Gray, a life-size marble work, and Idris Khan, an absolutely gorgeous work, which was commissioned for our purpose in a poem done in his method for us. The evening actually raised over 800,000 pounds, which for a small organization isn't bad, and it netted that because everything was covered. And then we ended up with also a lot of new patrons. And to me, that really spoke to the power of art, but also my job, which is to be engaged in the art world, and it will also, enrich you in other ways. And that is my ability to maybe give to my causes, to have positive impact. I just actually started supporting the most amazing, it's not on my resume because it's just very recent, a new initiative called a Garage out of Israel, which is the first and only art school in the world that is exclusively for students diagnosed or recovering from serious mental illness and emotional breakdown. So they not only embrace them and give them a creative outlet and creative education, but they create a network and support so they can go on to ongoing education and professional careers in the art world. And it has an extraordinary success rate. So those things are, again, with their, we're finding artists for them. Actually, my curator is finding artists for them. Tamar is working heavily to do a series of plays, to raise money. You know, all these things I think are one of the wonderful positive side effects of being involved in contemporary art. I hope I didn't.
And that's interesting because you mentioned in your amazing sort of fundraising initiative that there were artists like Etel Adnan included, amongst others, and a few people from the audience, Cheryl Finley, who teaches at Atlanta University, and also one or two others have asked, do you ever look at Middle Eastern artists? Amina Derbiche is also asking this. Do you have any in your collection?
I guess I would say I have representation more through the diaspora. So I have, I'm a big fan of Ali Ben Sadr. I have 4 works that I just absolutely adore. I have Diana Ladid, who I think is spectacular. But, you know, it's an interesting question. I do think actually that my exposure to Mideastern outside of some of diaspora artists is quite limited. And I think it's quite limited overall. So unless I think, just like Latin American art, I probably have a lesser representation, except for, again, Latin Americans who are working in America or working in Europe. That takes, to me, it's about seeing, and I think I just haven't spent enough time to see and actually get to know. Yeah, it is.
And I'm going to ask, just before we open it up more to the audience, because we've got some interesting questions pouring in, I'm just going to ask, pulling us back to the sort of topic of the talk today, can I ask you all for a sort of longer view on the future of the art world? Any changes that you think were brought about by the pandemic you think will have a longer impact, such as, you know, obviously the NFTs we talked about and artist royalties, but also are there any sort of breakdowns? I mean, Amy, I read a really interesting article with you that was said that it's better to be the disruption than have it change you, essentially. I'm paraphrasing, but so any sort of, you know, predictions on what sort of transformations we can see coming into the art world, you know, in the future? Can I ask each of you to share a few thoughts on that?
Well, everything that Alison is afraid of will happen. Sorry to say. I do feel that's likely to happen. Like, we are moving into a more robust competitive marketplace, and that can be good and it can be bad. Like, I guess any change can have its benefits and its drawbacks. I think what could happen as a result of that is there right now is kind of, there's not very many ways to make it in the art world as an artist. So I think that's been the funnel gets narrower and narrower as your career goes up the path, you know, up the pike. So I think there'll be, the good news is I think for a lot of artists, that sort of unilateral singular road to success might create interesting diverse highways you could take and still be a artist, being true to your work, practicing, but having a different kind of marketplace or a different kind of representation. You might never get a big New York gallery or a big London gallery. You might instead have a very successful digital audience following you and have a client base that way. You might be given opportunities for collaborations with products, businesses, films, Hollywood. That would be an interesting opportunity for a visual artist of a certain type who's interested in that opportunity. You might have a reasonably successful career in a completely more academic track if your work is non-material, you're doing performative work, etc. that might end up being successful because of the digital proliferation and ability to create an audience. So I think it's actually a win-win if, like all changes, you embrace it and bring like a kind of limber fearlessness about how you're going to handle it. But more capital, more technology, and unfortunately more legislation, regulation in terms that will be idiosyncratic and make perfectly no sense for a healthy market, but that'll happen.
Kate, would you want to share a few words on that?
Yeah, I think we're definitely in a landscape which is now much more digitally savvy. I think everybody, even those who really wanted to brand themselves a Philistine who would never have to engage, realize now that you have two selves. You have an online self, the one that I can see on the screen there, and I have my real life self. And I'm going to have to find ways to make them connect and ways to make them make sense in my head. I think that artists are probably more than ever before going to have the opportunity to find space for themselves, but whether the space looks like they thought it might look is another matter. So for example, I think with NFTs, they might end up becoming a new medium, or they might become a new market. If they do become a new market, I wonder whether or not they'll be like the print market, like Amy's saying, which I thought they might be, or whether they might be something like we would call street art, which is something which does exceptionally well, has huge followings, has millions and millions of people around the world who love street art, who want to buy street art, who know Banksy's name, or they've got a Shepard Fairey print, but are the kind of people who are not going to see the art that they like represented in museums and galleries in any great hurry. The Tate did their 2009 street art show, but aside from a few tiny things that happened in that little bubble, there's been no sustained representation of what we would call street art. It's become a strangely dirty word, and that's a taste issue, and I think that maybe the NFTs will do that as well. I think what's really exciting is that there is so much opportunity for artists to actually form communities with each other. So for a long time, artists were extremely isolated. You might be represented by a gallery if you were really lucky, and then you might attend your fellow artist's opening, and maybe you were gracious enough to be a good guest and not to criticize their work and get invited to the artist dinner, and maybe you were in group shows, but the relationships you had with other artists were pretty minimalistic. If you had gone to college, you may have a sort of a small community peer group, but I don't think there would be any sort of sustained engagement. And I think certainly expedited during the pandemic was artists working with other artists instead of in silos, and actually working with each other globally and using online platforms. And I think that there's an enormous space. If I had another life and I was tech savvy, then I would be thinking about some sort of social network platform for artists and how that could really, really help artists, just in terms of availability of information, how one goes about being an artist, how you look after your market, how you price your artworks, how you store your artwork successfully. I mean, there's just so many small things that artists don't have information about, and then also how you navigate a world that's changing all the time, and how you retain your integrity as an artist in doing that. It's a business, and an artist might not necessarily have the business mind to go along with their creative mind, and that's fair enough, but they won't necessarily get that gallery these days to take care of that for them. The number of artists that are going to get galleries is getting smaller and smaller and smaller because the market's changing so much. So I think a huge resource that artists don't get to use is other artists, and I think I would really, really hope that becomes more prevalent, and that artists have better relationships with their collectors. Alison clearly cherishes the relationships she has with the artist as much as she does the artwork, and I do as well at Soho House. Like I never just buy from a PDF. I always want to have at least a Zoom call. Like if I just want to meet artists. I love meeting artists, and so it's about relationships for me. And so I think hopefully that the pandemic will have expedited our way of connecting as individuals, as opposed to big organizations, big institutions, big galleries. Like we have to kind of take some power in this ability to be able to connect.
Great. So we've heard from the two art professionals, so I'm going to take a different stance, although I will respond from my perspective. First of all, as a trustee of the Royal Academy, which has the Royal Academy Schools, which is a postgraduate 3-year free postgraduate program, I would say, answer Amy's context, we've always done that. Artists that we enter into our school are facilitated to go into a number of different areas, and actually they're selected not always to be a gallery artist or to be in that avenue of selling their art in the commercial market, but education or just exploration in their own right. And they're actually very honest about that even in their applications. So I think that actually that's not new. I do agree that feeling that there is a broader market gives them more power to take on a challenge of finding whatever avenue suits them. And schools and so forth will probably adjust to facilitating that more. I feel very proud that the Royal Academy has always done that and will continue to do that. I also, in terms of responding to the market as a market person, as a banker, what happens when a market goes nuts is it gets regulated. And I'm not fearful of a bigger market. I just recognize that it already is showing signs of weakness or signs of what I think can breed a negative consequence. So I hope, I always hate overly regulated markets, but there will be more sort of, I think, regulation around the markets and we'll have fallout. And I'm kind of really excited about NFTs, and I think it's wrong to only focus on the technology of blockchain, because it's much bigger than that. It's the whole way of thinking, how we buy, how we connect, what's possible using technology, even in a multidisciplinary approach to art. I think it just brings about so much more than just NFTs. It just happens to be there's a big price tag on an NFT, so everybody only talks about that. But as a collector, I think that's very, very exciting. But for me as a collector, what I look forward to is I feel I need to duck and dive a little bit more. I need to be very true to myself, do a lot of research. If I see a piling in and a market distortion, what I would call a market distortion as a markets person, I'm going to pivot and I'm going to look for the next opportunity. So more than ever, I feel it's kind of important to me to be a bit braver, to be a bit ahead of the curve, follow your heart, follow your eye. And the eye better be pretty educated, unfortunately, but follow that, take good advice, talk to the professionals because they have a huge amount to contribute to this whole discussion. And I'll give you an example. Also think a little bit differently how you collect. So my intention, and always what I had done, and if one looked at my collection, they would see depth in artists. For me, it was about following these artists through their career, to see how they developed and to play into that development when and if appropriate. And it was a real joy. That's actually not always possible now because I'm too sensible. So my artists, if you have a good eye, your artist can go from 10,000 to 500,000 before you know it. And do you continue to buy them? And it's been a huge discussion amongst people that I'm collecting with. Where do we go from here? Do we keep collecting those artists? What is our reaction to this? And so that's something I'm sort of grappling with, and it's causing me to maybe rethink how I collect. Like these two on here, I have depth in those artists. Most of these artists I'll always have more following their career, and they do develop. But I think it will change how we collect. I hope it means that there isn't too much speculation in the market so that there can't be depth, because I think artists actually benefit from that, because in 50 years, 100 years, let's face it, there'll only be a small percentage of these artists still in the minds of the art world. And it'd be lovely to be able to locate those works, which maybe through NFTs will be, or through the blockchain will be possible, but also to see wonderful collections around wonderful artists.
And one last question from me, and I'm conscious we need to wrap up this fascinating talk. Thank you all. It's just as we see the end of the pandemic draw closer, what do you dream of doing next? Amy, I might ask you first. Go on. What's in there? You've got a summer stretching ahead of you, and hopefully an end to the pandemic at some point. What's your heart's desire? What would you like to do?
Well, I think the future is very bright, and I'm really, really interested in the ongoing disruption, and I'm interested in how it will play out for artists, and I'm interested how it will play out geographically, and I'm interested in understanding those opportunities and seeing, you know, synergy and benefit in them in my new business. So
are you allowed to tell us more about your museum that you're supporting back in your home?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm very connected to lots of museums, and I like to think I'm a friend to a lot of museums in helping them, you know, either find things they want for their collection or monetize things intelligently in their collection so they can buy new things for the collection that keep it moving forward. I'm very involved with the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York, my hometown, soon to be the Albright Knox Gunlock Art Museum in Buffalo, which is now under construction and building a wonderful new building. Big hole in the ground right now, starting to come out. That's, you know, my own hometown. Buffalo, New York is a city that for many people, in many people's minds, once was a great city, and but is on the return, and certainly has an art museum that is among the top in the United States and punches way above its weight, as we say. So I've been really having a great time as a diaspora Buffalonian, helping the museum, you know, come to the next level and be more inclusive. I mean, in lots of ways, the Albright Knox in the old days was, in my childhood, was really a golf club of a very small number of members who promulgated it and propagated the museum as it was. And, you know, as a result of that, many local artists in Buffalo, including Cindy Sherman and Robert Longo, who were students there, said, this stinks. The Albright Knox doesn't show our works, doesn't give us any time of day. And they started an alternative space called Hull Walls, which is still in existence as well. So looking for ways that the museum can grow past its history into the future and keep a spirit of zeitgeist and greatness and inclusion in that zeitgeist and greatness.
Kate, what would you think of doing once the doors open? Yeah, I like that. I like what you said earlier about leaving the doors open for others to come behind you.
Oh, that was beautiful. I love that.
Yeah. What door would you like to open going forward?
Do you know what I mean? I just like to catch up with myself. I think that I'm doing so much, and I'm so pleased to be doing so much, but I'm sort of getting to that stage of my career now where I have to work out like where I can best place my energy and my time for the maximum amount of usefulness for the sort of the people who need it the most, and what benefits me the most in terms of what I really enjoy doing. And I'm still working that out. You know, Soho House is a big company and it's global, and it's got so many exciting projects coming up. So I've got all of those to work on, which is really thrilling. And I'm just navigating that territory of how I can keep making them better, and not just better, but how can we be so progressive? How can we try and do a collection now that, as I was joking, that I won't want to update it in 5 years time? You know, how do I wrestle with a world that won't sit still? And will I ever be able to sit still within it? And really, I'm so committed to diversifying and allowing other people to come into the art world. And I do a lot of that through mentoring, and I do a lot of that through kind of hand-holding, and I really like that. But I'm now entering a situation where there's only so much of that I can actually even do anymore. So I'm in the interesting phase where I've sort of never been professionally more satisfied, but also trying to work out how the landscape will look in a few years. Can I do this but be a little bit quieter? Have a little bit more time to myself? Maybe not. Maybe it's just something I have to get used to. But it is, the thing is, it's an addiction. You know, I think exactly as Alison said, that there's this wanting to know about everything that's happening, and wanting to be part of it, and wanting to be part of this story, and feel that you are part of this piece of history that's unraveling. Is really compelling. And hearing from these artists and very often getting blown away by an artist and saying, oh God, that's just a perspective on the world that I didn't even know existed. And they pile up and pile up and pile up. And, you know, I could just give each of these artists that I work with a museum show. I'm so thrilled and fascinated by them. So a reckoning with how much great art there is in the world and how little time there is. That's my plan. And if I manage to come up with the answer to that, all of you guys, then I will gladly share it and make my millions, because effectively it's a time machine, isn't it?
And Alison, how about you?
This was an unexpected one, and I could already list like 10 things on my list. So I'll pull off 3 that I will do. First of all, I run an artist residency, as you mentioned, in Italy. And we've been on hold for 2 years. And we've been in conversations with artists who we had lined up who are dying to come. And it makes a difference for them because we always are choosing artists that really will need the experience, want the experience to expand, their perspective and continue developing and so forth. And they have actually told me exactly which artisans they want to, work with to investigate new medium. And we're all really excited. And then, 2 years of nothing. So I am waiting to reinvigorate that and get started with that. And hopefully, we thought it would be this year, but unfortunately, I think we're going to be skipping this year. So it's next year. It gives us also a bit of time to think, oh, wow, with everything that's happening, what else can I do there? Is there lots of room, maybe some seminars. So anyway, that discussion needs to be continued. Also, we've had lots of time to think. So I've been dreaming of projects that I can even help with. For instance, I have one artist, emerging artist, who's spectacular performance and painting artist, who I would think would be perfect for working with the Royal Opera House and doing doing some screen work, doing some of the stage work because of what she does. So I'm going to try my hand. I'll probably be ignored, but I'm going to try my hand at making some introductions because I have a number of artists like that, and I'm working with a number of institutions who are pretty actually open-minded, so who would probably cherish at least the conversation, and maybe it would go somewhere. And finally, my boys. I have 2 sons in New York who have dutifully been trying to keep up, but they're also really anxious to hit the pavement and learn more. They're of that age. They're starting their own collections as well as taking some of my art out of storage. And so I really want to be more engaged with them because it's not a great way to transfer wealth, but it's a great way to communicate with children who are starting to have families, whose careers are taking off and don't have a lot of time for us. So I'm sort of raising my hand going, this is something we can really share. And they're responding. So those are my sort of top 3. Yeah.
It's interesting because Amin Rasham has just written in the Q&As that we're moving towards a more solitary life in some ways because of this pandemic. We're all spending a lot of time at home. And he's an artist, and he says, I paint in my studio or I perform and then I publish it inside the space. And, a large part of art is enjoyment, and he's having to learn how to enjoy it differently. Mm-hmm. And I think at the same time, what I'm getting from all 3 of you is that there's this sense of wanting to give back. I mean, you've spent this time a little bit isolated from other people, but you're coming out of that with a sense of wanting to give back to community, whether it's supporting the artist, whether it's supporting the art spaces of your childhood, whether it's supporting your children in their collections or with your residencies. And I think that's quite an uplifting kind of note to move forward on, is this sense of community collaboration and sort of, giving back. I think I'd like to end with that. So thank you all for giving us your time today, for sharing your experiences, your insights, your knowledge, and from all the audience as well, an enormous thank you for answering their questions. And thank you again, Roxanne. We hope we see everyone in Abu Dhabi in November. And in the meanwhile, look forward to any feedback for anyone via email. We can always forward it on if you had further questions. But for now, thank you. Thank you, Roxanne. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. We've loved having you with us and wish you a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both Kate and Alison also.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Thank you. Take care.